So last year, I was dating this guy, and he told me, I feel like you give me more of your frustrations than your feelings. Frustrations are the outward expression, sometimes in the form of anger, sometimes in the form of like an attitude, short temperedness. And our feelings can be expressed without a display of unpleasantries. Our feelings can be expressed gently. And that's kind of what we're going to be discussing today, gentle conflict, as we continue on the top tier series, Family Edition. Today, we'll be jumping into part two on the topic of gentle conflict. And we're going to jump in right when we get back from the intro. You are excellence. Your mind is of excellence. Your visions are of excellence. Your unique superpower is nothing short of excellence. You amplify a voice of excellence. Your contribution to this world will be of excellence. You will achieve your highest goals and desires with excellence. Excellence in everything, every time. Happy Tuesday. Thank you for joining another episode of Excellence in Everything Live. If I have never, ever, ever met you, my name is Linnita Hostin, and I use this platform to teach practical communication skills so that we can create better connections with those that we love and those that we lead. I always say, imagine if a life coach and a emotional wellness coach got together and had a baby, they would probably make me. I'm at the intersection of life skills and social and emotional wellness, and super passionate about that work. This year will make year 10 for me. If you are joining live, let me know that you're here and watching. Just say, hey, I am here. You can type in the comments, I'm her. And if you happen to catch the replay, you can type in hashtag replay. We'd love to hear your thoughts. If you have questions, chime in. If something is said that resonates with you, say that. And the last thing I'll say is if you're tuning in from YouTube, go ahead and click that subscribe button so that you can be notified about our weekly content. And also, you can go ahead and click the like button too and share with someone that you think may benefit from today's lessons. So, I'm a big word person. I use words very intently. And when I Googled gentle conflict, nothing came up. So it's not a term that's being commonly used. Um, but today I want to kind of define what that is and then provide some practical tools from a family dynamics of how when conflict arises, we can handle it gently. So when we think about gentleness, we think kind like, we think even or mild tempered. And when we think about conflict, we think about a disagreement, sometimes a physical one, sometimes it's a verbal one, sometimes it's an unpleasant experience. So put a kind like argument or kind like disagreement together, and that is what I define as gentle conflict. I feel like we have the capacity, if we have the language and we have the courage, we have the capacity to be gentle when dealing with conflict. And I don't know if you realize this, but there's reasons why we avoid conflict. And I want to show you what those reasons of why. When I mentioned this earlier, we fear rejection. We fear being invalidated, like our feelings don't matter or our understanding does not matter. Or we fear that the person's perception of our feelings is not valued. We also fear conflict because we fear judgment. So the fact that we even have that feeling or emotion, the fact that we even feeling some kind of way, like, that don't feel good either. And sometimes we avoid conflict or, conflict or disagreements because we fear the consequence of what it may mean to speak up. We fear how the other person may respond to what we're saying, especially when you have a power dynamic. You have a leader over top of a subordinate, or you have a parent over top of a child. We fear the consequences of us expressing how we feel. Those are some of the reasons why we avoid conflict. And, I'm a big advocate that we should not avoid it because there's so many physiological impacts that it has on your body. And before I get to that, one of the biggest reasons why I think we should not avoid having conflict in general is because when we are when we decide not to have the conversation, we are accepting the assumptions that we've made in our head about what happened, what the person's intentions were, and why they might have done what they did. And so those assumptions continue. They actually compound when we don't have a chance, or we don't give them the ability to actually express and share what actually happened. Also, a byproduct of avoiding conflict is that we are storing that frustration in our bodies. So if you find that you have a disagreement, or you're feeling like a disagreement is arising because you have stored frustration, that if it's not coming out, it's staying in. So if you have a tightness of chest, if you have pain in your neck or shoulder area, maybe you have difficulty sleeping, loss of appetite, you might notice changes in your mood. Those could be signs of stored frustration in your body. So your body will have a physiological effect, or a physiological, like, what's the word I'm looking for? You if you're really good at noticing the changes in your body around the times in which you're frustrated, you can see the strain that is putting on not just your mind but your organs too. If you've heard the phrase stress will kill you, what people are really referring to is the pressure that it puts on the organs in your body, such as your heart, because your blood pressure is rising. So all of that is a compounding impact, or a compounding effect, I should say, of having the stored frustrations. So we have to get them out. And part of getting them out is getting it out in a way in which a person could receive what is actually being said. And I always say, when we get better at resolving conflict, we are allowing ourselves to release stress from our body. Like, there's a release that actually happens when we take what's inside and we let it out. We have the privilege, or more privilege, to live in peace or in harmony, even when things are not going well. But you have an opportunity to live in peace, even in like chaotic times. Also, when we get out how we feel in the inside, when we get it out in the outside, we have the ability to improve our relationships. So by working on what I call a conflict muscle, you are creating a communication channel, and a communication like a habit with the person that you love or lead, and the byproduct of that is an improved relationship. And lastly, when we get better at having conflict in general, but today's topic is about gentle conflict, we get more of the things that we need, because we begin to express those needs, and the byproduct of that is getting the things that we want, getting the behaviors that we want, getting um the requests or our acts from others. We get those things. Those are the byproduct. So I want to talk about one um one way. I want to go deep today, and not why. Why would be giving you a lot of things. I want to choose one thing, and I want to go deep in the way in which we can have gentle conflict. And it's really simple. And I'm all about practicality, but we have to grow our courage. Courage is the fearlessness of doing something without um I say doing it with, maybe you don't have the full confidence, but you be willing to try. It's the willingness to try something even if you don't have the full confidence. And a lot of that has a lot to do with being bold enough to speak up for the things that we want. And so when I say grow your courage, the translation of that is literally ask for what you need. When I started today's show, I mentioned to you a previous guy that I was dating said that I often give my frustrations and not my feelings. This is a really good example of growing, of the opportunity to grow in courage. When we are giving feelings, we are giving people an opportunity to have insight to the root of why we have the frustration. So I'll give an example of this. If, let's say, you have multi-generations in the home. Let's say you have a teenage child, an aging grandparent, and you have the parents home. And let's say around the evening time, when the aging grandparent usually wants to relax, the teenage child is blasting music. They have a habit of doing this. So the aging parent typically, maybe their response is coming into the room, into the teenage child's room and turning the music off. This is a good example. Turning the music off and saying, "Stop all that noise around here," and closing the door. That would be an example of the expression of frustration because the feeling was never expressed. I think that gentle conflict with when we're gentle in our conflict, we have to explain why we have the feeling or what the root of the feeling is. So, cutting the music off and closing the door did not explain why maybe the aging grandparent has a disdain about that music playing that time of day. So, an approach where you were sharing your feelings and not and not you were sharing your feelings and not showing your frustrations would be the Asian grandparent opens the door and says, "Hey, um, do you mind if you could turn the volume down on your music in the evening time because I have difficulty falling asleep, or it'd be easier for me to fall asleep if I were not being disrupted by the music. Do you think you could turn it down a bit?" Or saying, "Hey, it kind of bothers me that sometimes I feel like you don't respect the fact that it's late and I'm old. I want to get rest. Do you mind turning it down a bit?" So the feeling is that maybe the lack of respect. The feeling is the inconsideration for the volume at that time of hour, but it would come out in frustration, like stop, or don't do that. So gentle conflict will look like the expression of the feeling, obviously in a tone that could be receptive or be received by the other end. The thing about conflict is that we don't have the we don't get to determine the response of the other person. And even if we're so gentle on this side, there's no guarantee that the recipient will return that gentleness. And we can't control other people's responses and behaviors. We can only control ourselves. And I would say, we're responsible for the behaviors that we're modeling, because what we model, we teach. So there'll be some things that we model that we're teaching, and we may not see the fruit of that for years to come. That is not a reason to resort back to unhealthy ways because we feel like they get immediate results. Sometimes, and one of the pastors said this at my church this weekend. He said, you're doing it right when it's hard. And I absolutely agree with that. Hey, blind wife and his blind guy and his wife, their life. He says that courage is a gentle endeavor as well. Yeah, that's true. Great point. I agree. Courage is definitely a gentle endeavor as well. And so we were talking about growing in courage and expressing your feelings and not just your frustration. I gave you an example of that. And another way we can have gentle conflict is in growing in our language. And so there's this thing that sometimes we resort to when we're in a high feeling of frustration. We use things that are stated in what's called absolutes, like you never, you always, I can never. Um, those statements indicate that at no point ever were you displaying something else. You absolutely always, without a shadow of a doubt, do this one thing. There are some instances where people do, but those instances in comparison to a person giving, maybe they have, it's common for them to do it, but do they really do it all the time? So sometimes modifying our language to eliminate those kinds of things, those absolutes, are a great way to grow in courage. And I would say it's an example of growing in courage because it takes a lot of um, like thinking through what you're going to say and how the person will receive it. And I don't remember where I read this from a few weeks ago, as I was studying. I'm always studying communication styles, and the person that authored this article said that it's not what you say, it's what the person hears. And I thought that was so powerful because we often hear it's not what you say, it's how you say it. but even how you say it could be perceived differently than what the person hears. So it makes me think that when we're attempting to communicate something that may be challenging, we should think through what the person may hear with the language that we are using, and trying our best to use language that they would have, that it would be very clear what you mean by that. So let me give you an example of this. So let's say you have, um, let's say you have a, let's say you two married spouses are having a disagreement, and maybe the husband says, um, um, maybe the husband says, I lost my whole train of thought. Um, okay, maybe the wife says to the husband, the food will always be cold. The reason why your food is cold because you always come home late. The food wouldn't be cold if you were here on time, right? That's an example of someone, a person giving their frustrations and not their feelings. And so what the husband could hear could be, my food would be warm if I came on time. So maybe I wouldn't have cold food if I came on time. That's what he heard, but that's not what she probably meant. Maybe she meant, I'd like to have you here at dinner's time. That's an important time for me. That's completely different than getting there on time and the food being warm. So always thinking about what you want the person to hear. Now, again, it'll always be up for their interpretation. So that's why we should use the most simplified, most plain language possible. And that means you actually have to think that through. You literally have to think that through. Alicia said, we have to unlearn everything we know with regards to communication and basically learn another or better way to communicate. Yeah. Essentially, yeah. There is a lot of, well, depending on how you were raised, there may be a lot of things to unlearn. A lot, actually. And if you think about all of the influences that touch us in our lifetime, whoever babysat us, if we were on any athletic teams, whoever coached us, if we did tutoring, if we spend a substantial amount of time in church and youth ministry, we're in Girl Scouts, Boy Scouts, all of those influences literally are the makeup of our personalities. And to some degree our communication styles. We are the direct result of all of those touch points. So if you had a lot of healthy touch points, it's likely you have some really strong and healthy communication skills. If you had some unhealthy touch points, more unhealthy touch points than healthy, then your communication skills may need development. And that would require a lot of unlearning. I think it's harder to unlearn something than it is to learn something new. And people say the older you get, the harder it is to learn. If it's harder to learn as you age, then it gotta be twice as hard to unlearn as you age as well. But you're right. There are a lot of things. Blind guy, his wife, their life says the oxymoron of gentle conflict is real when we're adjusting our language to be more neutral and open to others' perspectives. It's tough. It is tough. And listen, these are three things I wanted to say. Two things I wanted to say. In the book Difficult Conversations, one of my favorite books about having hard conversations softly, it talks about like the three conversations that are happening in the minds of persons while they're amidst of conflict. So 6 conversations are happening. So if I'm in if I'm in an argument with Dan, I have 3 conversations happening in my head, and Dan has 3 conversations. So we're coming to the table with 6 conversations happening. The first conversation is who's wrong. Like I'm feeling like Dan is wrong. Dan's feeling like, no, she's wrong. The second conversation is like, what happened? So if you think about it, when you're in conflict with someone, you each have a different story. This is why we can't draw assumptions. Each of you have a different story or recounting of what happens. And so when we come to the table, sometimes in conflict, we're automatically coming with a spirit of blame and criticism. We're coming to tell the person, like, this is what I observed. You did this. And in the book, it talked about the importance of coming to the table to get understanding about what the other person experienced and why the conflict is occurring. That's a completely different energy. It's also a different level of emotional maturity as well. And it's very hard. But it is the most freeing book that I've read in terms of giving you not just courage, but like empowerment to walk into what we would call the fiery furnace to have hard conversations gently. I highly recommend that book for sure. Alika said, in my era, children are to be seen and not heard. Whatever the adult said was expected to be done without questions or back talk. In my era, too. In my era, too. I just happened to have been. I was a silent kid. I was the good kid. I didn't do a lot of talking back, because I actually feared my parents, and I don't think that that's a bad thing. I feared disappointing them and not being respectful. I don't know if that fear currently exists with children today. Not all of them. They have a very keen sense of expression where you almost have to be firm in teaching them where the boundary lies between expressing yourself and being respectful. There's a fine line that I sometimes feel like they cross that we have to teach them the boundaries for. So yeah, that definitely has the era that we came from, that I came from too. And so, but I will say this: I think how we got to gentle parenting, and I would add gentle conflict, is seeing the disempowerment that happens when we don't see our kids. So it manifests in different ways. Sometimes it manifests with them not being able to speak up and self advocate for themselves, or not being as expressive in their feelings, or not feeling safe enough to express those things. That kind of shows up in their relationships. Sometimes in as they age. Remember, we talked about it's harder to change, it's harder to unlearn. And as you age, probably twice as hard to unlearn. So that shows up in marriages. So we're seeing the generational impact of when we disempower the language or communication of our children versus teaching them the boundary. That is definitely really hard to teach. Definitely really hard to teach. Hey, Meaty, thank you for joining. Good to see you. Um, and Alika said, agreed. Awesome. I want to share this last thing, this quote that I saw online, and it basically says that one of the pitfalls in communication um, and conflict is criticism and blame. And I mentioned this earlier, but if a person already feels like, if you are coming to the table to have a hard conversation, they already feel like they're being blamed, their guards are going to be all the way up. You are not going to be receptive if you feel like you are being misunderstood, maybe misinterpreted. So the way that we have gentle conflict is by eliminating those guards. We can't do that if a person feels like they're being blamed or criticized. So one of the ways we come to the table with, and this is how you would have gentle conflict, you come to the table to have understanding. So a practical way of doing that would just say, hey, I just want to talk about what happened. From your perspective, tell me what happened. And there's no guard there because that person gets to simply express what happened in their eyes. And then you, as the person who initiated the conflict, you'll come back and say, well, this is what I felt like, or this is what I observed. In that moment alone, you may each find that each of you could see how you could have contributed to maybe inflaming behaviors from the other person. And then it just depends on the maturity of a person. Some people just can't take fault for anything. They can't see how they may have impacted someone. They certainly won't acknowledge it. There are some people whom are like that. And you will know that about the person when you're approaching them. And being okay, or learning to be okay and accepting that the person may not have the emotional maturity to do that, but that not being a reflection of your lack of communication skills. But it's definitely worth the effort. Remember, everything that we Model, we are teaching. So if you are modeling this in your marriage, you're modeling gentle conflict, you're teaching that to your spouse. This is how I want to talk things out. If you're modeling gentle conflict with your children, you're teaching them this is how you talk things out. Everything that we model, we're teaching. And so not everything that we model will manifest immediately in a teaching. It will take years for a person sometimes to outwardly display what was modeled. Think about some of the behaviors that you might have adapted, healthy and unhealthy, that have manifested in other areas of your life. It was not immediate, but it happened. Like your work ethic skills or maybe your budgeting skills. Those things manifested over time. They were not an immediate change. So just think that through and give those that we love grace. Oh, Weldon, thank you for joining. Are we related? Your last name is Holston, and there aren't that many Holstons on the earth. There's a term that people often use, you don't fit it. You don't fit in, as you alluded to. This, I believe, is a direct result of a child not being heard. Or given a platform, letting him or her know that their opinion matters. That's so good. That's a really practical example of when we create a safe space for our children to express themselves, the domino effect of that, or the byproduct, is increased confidence. Thank you for sharing that. Think about how you develop confidence. How do you develop confidence as the adult? Because sometimes we have to put ourselves back in those time periods. I know I develop confidence when I can do something well and people let me do that. Like when I was younger, I could draw really well. So if I was assigned to draw something and then I would get praised for doing that. I also grew in confidence when I was allowed to share how I felt, and the other person, even if they didn't agree, they acknowledged the thing that I shared with them. So I felt respected. So you're right. It does give them, it's a great reminder that practicing gentle conflict and allowing them to express the byproduct of that is giving them an outlet of self-expression. Last thing I'll say this, and then we'll wrap up. And while I'm wrapping up, if you have any key takeaways from tonight, I would love for you to share those. Share with me one thing that you took away from tonight. But when you meet a young man or a young woman whose chest it's high, like they walk in a room with this aura of confidence, and it's not an arrogant posture. It's like it's it's healthy self-esteem, what I would call it. Typically, those types of teens or young adults are really good at verbally expressing, like, not just their opinion, but how they feel, and orchestrating an opinion about other things. Well, you grow in confidence and expression when you have a chance to practice it and it's received. So basically, you have a chance to have dialogue with someone, for them to share back and forth and to give insight, and you to feel like you were heard and respected. That is probably the how that child or young adult is able to show up that way. So I'm always about reverse engineering. So if we want them to show up this way, then we reverse engineer everything that it would take to build up the characteristics of that kind of person, so that when time travels, they can show up this way. And I just wanted to to remind us of that, being intentional. This is where they are, but we want them to be here. So sometimes if we say, yeah, they're just a child right now, but you want them to be independent, self-sufficient. You want them to be financially keen. You want them to be verbally expressive. You want them to be intentional, observant. So we teach them those things now. We model that now as a form of teaching, because the outcome is what we are maybe sowing to see at a later time. All right, key takeaways. I'm always modeling, so do what I want to see. Yes, display the behaviors that you want to see. This is hard. Listen, if this was easy stuff, this show would not be called Excellence in Everything Live. I hope I'm not giving the perception that this is easy to do. This is hard as hell. This is very hard. When I talk about excellence, I talk about our highest quality of effort. And this series for this month is called Top Tier Talk. So, yeah, this is hard stuff that has the greatest impact on those that we love and lead. And again, if it's hard, sometimes that is an indication that we're actually doing it right. That's all I'm going to say. We are well over our time for tonight. I did not intend to stay this long, but obviously I enjoy talking about these things. Thank you for keeping it and hanging in there with me. We're going to continue. We have one more topic on Top Tier Talk to continue this week. And thank you for joining, and I will see you next Tuesday at 8:30, 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. I love you. There's absolutely nothing you could do about it. You are excellent. Your mind is of excellence. Your visions are of excellence. Your unique superpower is nothing short of excellence. You amplify a voice of excellence. Your contribution to this world will be of excellence. You will achieve your highest goals and desires with excellence. Excellence in everything, every